On the night Evelyn Grace Sutton disappeared, she left her porch light on, her coffee still warm on the counter, and her 4-year-old daughter asleep in the next room. She never came back for either one. For 31 years, the people of Millhaven County believed they knew exactly what happened to her. They were wrong about almost all of it. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Millhaven was the kind of town where everyone's name meant something to somebody else. Evelyn had grown up 2 streets from the church, married young to a man named Russell Combs, and settled into a life that looked, from the outside, like every other life on that stretch of road. She worked mornings at the pharmacy counter downtown, kept a garden nobody could compete with, and drove her daughter Claire to school every day in a pale blue station wagon that the whole neighborhood recognized by sound before they ever saw it turn the corner. Nobody in Millhaven imagined that anything about Evelyn's life needed explaining, until the morning she simply wasn't there anymore. Her disappearance was reported by her husband at 7:40 in the morning, a full 9 hours after anyone had last seen her. He told the responding officer that she had gone to bed early with a headache and that he assumed she was still asleep when he left for the night shift at the mill. He said he found the bed untouched when he came home. The porch light was on. The coffee pot was full. Claire was awake in her crib, crying, alone in the house for hours before her father returned. From that first morning, something about the timeline never quite lined up, though it would take investigators the better part of 3 decades to understand exactly what it meant. The search that followed was the largest Millhaven had ever seen. Volunteers walked the tree line along Route 9 for 6 days straight. Divers searched the quarry twice. Her photograph, a soft focus portrait taken the previous Easter, appeared on flyers stapled to every telephone pole between the county line and the interstate. Detective Walter Combs, no relation to Russell despite the shared name, a coincidence the town never stopped mentioning, was assigned the case in its 2nd week and would carry it, unofficially, for the rest of his career. He was 34 years old at the time, new enough to homicide work that he still believed most disappearances resolved themselves within days. Evelyn's case taught him otherwise, and it never fully let him go. The early theory was straightforward, and for a long time, nobody had reason to question it. A woman leaves in the night, on foot, without her coat, without her car, without a single dollar taken from the household account. The working assumption was that she'd been taken from the road while walking, perhaps to clear her head after an argument nobody would ever confirm happened. Russell told investigators there had been no argument. Neighbors weren't so sure. Mrs. Aldridge, who lived across the street and rarely missed anything, told officers she'd heard raised voices from the Combs house more than once that spring, though she admitted she'd never actually seen anything that would count as proof of trouble. Her statement went into the file and stayed there, unexamined, for years. Walter Combs interviewed Russell 4 times in the first month alone. Each time, the story held steady in its broad shape but shifted slightly in its details, the kind of small inconsistencies that meant nothing on their own and everything in combination. The headache that sent Evelyn to bed early was, in one telling, a migraine she'd had before, and in another, something new and unusual for her. The porch light, Russell first said, was something Evelyn always left on. Later, he said he couldn't remember whether it was her habit or his. Walter wrote each version down without comment, the discipline of a young detective who had not yet learned to trust his own instincts over the paperwork in front of him. 18 months into the investigation, with no body, no confirmed sighting, and no physical evidence connecting Russell to any wrongdoing, the case went cold in the way small-town cases often do, not officially closed, simply set aside for lack of anywhere left to look. Russell remarried within 2 years, moved Claire into a new household with a stepmother named Diane who raised her, by most accounts, with real and steady kindness. Claire grew up believing the story she'd been told, that her mother had likely wandered off during a mental health crisis nobody around her had known how to recognize, and had either died alone somewhere in the county or started a new life too far away and too ashamed to ever come back. Neither explanation was true, though both contained a fragment of something real. Claire Sutton turned 31 in the same year her mother would have turned 62, and it was that specific coincidence of ages that finally pulled her toward the file her father had never let her read as a child. She contacted the sheriff's department that spring, expecting little, and was surprised to find that Walter Combs, now 68 and long retired, still answered his phone when the department called to ask if he'd speak with Evelyn's daughter. He agreed without hesitation. He had, in his own words, been waiting for that phone call for longer than he cared to admit, certain the case would eventually reopen itself if he simply lived long enough to see it happen. Their first meeting lasted 4 hours. Walter walked Claire through the original file page by page, including sections she had never known existed, Mrs. Aldridge's statement about raised voices, a partial print lifted from the porch light switch that had never matched anyone in the household database, and a gas station receipt found 11 miles from Millhaven, time-stamped just after midnight on the night Evelyn vanished, for a purchase made in cash by someone the clerk on duty could no longer clearly remember. None of it had been enough to build a case in the 90s. Together, decades later, it was enough to make Claire ask a question nobody in her family had ever said out loud. She asked whether her father might have been the reason her mother never came home. The answer, when it finally arrived 8 months later, was both simpler and stranger than either of them expected. A woman working under the name Ellen Whitfield in a small city 4 states away recognized her own face in an old missing persons segment reposted online as part of a true crime research group's renewed interest in the case. She had built a quiet, careful life in that city for nearly 3 decades, a life built entirely on the belief that leaving in silence was the only way she would ever be allowed to leave at all. She had not vanished into tragedy. She had walked out of one, on foot, on Route 9, in the dark, choosing a version of survival that required her to disappear completely from the only life anyone had ever known her to have. When Walter finally sat across from her in a small interview room 3 counties from where the case had begun, Evelyn did not describe monsters or headlines. She described something quieter and, in its own way, harder to hear, years of control so gradual she hadn't recognized its shape until she was already inside it, a husband whose anger never showed itself to neighbors but reliably found her once the door was closed, and a final night when leaving with nothing felt safer than staying with everything. She said she had wanted to take Claire with her and couldn't find a way to do it without being found within hours. She said not a single day passed in 31 years that she didn't think about that choice, and she never once decided it had been the wrong one, only the most impossible one she had ever had to make. Claire's reunion with her mother did not happen the way either of them might have imagined it as children. There were no cameras waiting, no dramatic embrace staged for an audience, only 2 women sitting across a table in a quiet room, working slowly through 3 decades neither one had been present for in the other's life. Evelyn asked about the pale blue station wagon, gone for 20 years by then. Claire asked about the garden, and Evelyn said she still kept one, smaller now, in the backyard of the house she built under a name that wasn't technically her own but had become, in every way that mattered, entirely hers. Russell Combs was never formally charged. The statute of limitations and the near-total absence of physical evidence made any prosecution functionally impossible, a detail that still sits uneasily with almost everyone who worked the case. He died 4 years before Evelyn was found, having spent the final decades of his life telling anyone who asked that his wife had abandoned her own child without explanation, a version of events that shaped how an entire town remembered a woman it had never fully understood. Walter Combs, the detective who carried the file longer than anyone expected him to, says the ending of this case is not the ending he pictured when he was 34 years old and certain that missing people were always eventually found the same way, alive or otherwise. What he found instead was a woman who had never actually been lost at all, only hidden, by circumstances a small town spent 31 years failing to see clearly. If you're wondering how many more stories like this one are sitting quietly in cold case files across the country, unresolved not because nobody is looking, but because nobody has asked the right question yet, that number is almost certainly larger than any of us would like to believe.